right, good afternoon, everyone. We are going to call our Finance and Committee meeting to order, our January meeting. But before we get started, I'll wait for Ms. Evans to get situated. I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes from January 16th, 2024. Motion by Dr. Eames, seconded by Mr. Hershey. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. The ayes have it. And today's topic is Fund Balance 101. And so, Mr. Nieder, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Chair of the Finance Committee, Johnson. And today what we'd like to do is give you some background on fund balance. Who prescribes what this is, how we account for it, share with you the different components of the fund balance. After we go through that, help give you an understanding of one of the board's policies, Board Policy 8101, which speaks with one specific component of fund balance, give you a little history on that. And then as we go through reviewing the different components, share with you what can the different categories of fund balance be used for? What do they represent when you look at that sheet in the annual comprehensive financial report? So just some background on fund balance. There's a body called the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, GASB, that defines exactly what fund balance is for governmental organizations and agencies in this country. And this GASB, and there's one particular GASB pronouncement we're going to see in a minute that defines fund balance, applies to the local school districts across the country, as well as government agencies across the country. And the specific GASB pronouncement is GASB 54, which defines and directs fund balance. And again, we'll speak a little bit more further on about how GASB 54 speaks to the Board Policy 8101. So, GASB 54 is what I said, defines and prescribes what governmental agencies have to do as it relates to tracking of fund balance and reporting on it. Just to give you a sense, it's a pretty extensive statement, almost 140 pages of very detailed and complex information. And this is, I'll just absorb how much is in there, and no, we're not going to go through all of this today. So I'm going to just cover a couple excerpts from the beginning, again, to set the stage. And again, this is straight out of the GASB 54. The statement establishes an accounting and financial reporting standards for all governments that report governmental funds. It establishes criteria for classifying fund balances into specifically defined classifications and clarifies definitions for governmental fund types. And then the second and last one I just want to share with you, again out of GASB 54, fund balance for governmental funds should be reported in classifications that comprise a hierarchy based primarily on the extent to which the government is bound to honor constraints, et cetera, and it provides classifications in the following paragraphs. We're not going to go through that. So again, it's prescribing the different categories of a fund balance that the Board of Education must maintain in its financial reporting. So we're going to take this very complex pronouncement out of GASB and try to simplify it, and to do that, give it relevance to the Board of Education and the Board of Education's fund balance, which is contained, reporting on is contained within your annual comprehensive financial report. So this page here is taken straight out of the board's June 30th, 2024 annual financial report, and it is the statement on the board's fund balance. You can see going across the top the different major funds, not the fund balances, but the different major funds. And the primary fund within the board's finances is the general fund. That's the main fund, but then you see a few other funds as well. And then as you go vertically across the left descriptions, those are the different categories of fund balance that are prescribed by GASB 54. And today, we're going to walk you through the general fund balances and give you an explanation of what those are, what they mean. But effectively, the categories, whether they're in this general fund or in other major funds or non-major funds, all have parallel application about what they can and can't be used for and what's in there. And before I continue, and I think you'll see this as we go through the next slides, these amounts in these different categories aren't all dollars. And they're not, in fact, most of these are not available to be utilized. They're reserved for specific purposes, and some don't even represent dollars.
So, Mr. Need, if I may, that's the next slide, right? Talking about what's not a dollar.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to go through each of the categories where the board has balances. The first category is called non-spendables and inventories. So you see on that prior slide, almost $5 million, $4.9 million on June 30th of non-spendable inventories. Those are not dollars. Well, what is that? Well, all the supplies, for example, at a Rock Quarry warehouse, school supplies that are on our books, that's in that number. When we pre-purchase diesel fuel for our yellow bus fleet, when we see a dip in the market and we haven't used it yet, it's effectively in inventory. The value of that is in this. The transportation department repair parts that they stock in their inventory are in that number. So that's what that $5 million represents. There are things that have already been purchased, but we have to, based on GASB 54, report them in the fund balance. But again, it's not funding that's available for expenditure. The next category we have is called stabilization by state statute. And as of June 30th, the amount in that category was about $9.3 million, just under $9.3 million. So what exactly is that? That includes accounts receivable, revenues that are due us that we haven't received yet. And some of those would be things like a good one to use as an example. The board has leases across the county for cell phone towers on our properties. And we get payments on those on a monthly basis. So those payments that haven't been received yet or at the end of the year would be included in this category. Another major driver for this category is something called carry forward purchase orders. And let me help explain what's a carry forward purchase order. Well, when we enter into a contract for anything over $2,500, we require a purchase order. And before you can get the purchase order, you have to encumber the funds and have the funds available. As we reach the end of a fiscal year, there are some contracts where not all the work has been completed, and the remaining work has to be ideally completed in the beginning of the following fiscal year. So we have a process. They have to go ultimately through our finance officer, Trish Posey, for approval. We're not going to approve everything that someone just wants to carry over. But if we deem it to be based on a valid purpose, we will carry it over. But those amounts in those carryover purchase orders have to be reported in the board's fund balance as well in this category. And that's probably the primary driver of the dollar amount, that $9.3 million amount. And again, just as the previous category, while it's reported in a fund balance, it's not funding that's available for use. It's already been committed. So the next category is called assigned for special projects. And the amount that was in place and reported on the ACFR on June 30th was $11.3 million. These are special projects reserved for specific use. The two main drivers of the balance in June 30th were targeted enrollment funds. And target enrollment funds, just as a reminder, are funds that we reserved. Terry, what was the amount? $7-8 million. About $7-8 million that were reserved at the end of the year for use in the current year to allot out to schools above and beyond the standard funding formulas to address different issues. At the beginning of the year, where we have allotment reconciliation issues, and we may need to give a few more months of teacher or a different position or full teacher, sometimes multiple teachers, to a school to handle some kind of complication where the standard allotment formula is not going to be sufficient to support a school. And this happens a lot at our multi-track year-round schools because things don't slice and dice neatly. These funds are then available to go to schools. They're just for schools. And then we maintain that because things can change at a school during the year as well. And then the second major item in here are the settlement funds that we've received thus far for the vaping settlements from both Juul and Altria, I believe was the other organization. So those are reserved here too. And again, GASB 54 says we need to put them in this category, but again, it's reserved specifically for these two programs. Okay, the next item in the board's fund balance is called, it's in the assigned category, but it's a separate line item, it's insurance. And on the June 30th report, that was $15.58 million. So what's in this category? The major two drivers up here are, and I'm going to take the second bullet first. The board self-insures for our workers' compensation claims for our locally funded employees. When we have a workers' comp claim and it has to be paid out, if it's a state-funded employee, the state will cover those costs. But if it's a locally funded employee or a state-funded employee who also gets a local supplement, we have to use local funding to pay either for that local employee or for that piece of the state-funded employee, the supplement piece, in a similar ratio. And we're self-insured, which means we maintain a balance in this reserve to pay the claims rather than go with an outside insurance company. District went to this, it's been at least probably 20 years ago, it precedes me. It was deemed at the time, and we continue to have somebody assess this with us, an outside consultant each year. Is this still the best practice to do it self-insured versus going out in the open market? So this category includes those reserves as well as reserves for potential claims throughout the year that would go either beyond the liability coverage that the board has through their different risk management insurance carriers, or to cover deductibles which are paid before we even hit that. And Trish, are we still, and Cecil, are we still at $250K deductible primarily for liability?
For most things, there are some variations sometimes within coverage ranges, but that's the $250K right now with the money.
Yeah, so effectively, we as a district for a claim let's say it's several $100,000, our policy, we pay the first 250, and this reserve is what we're paying for. Again, this category of fund balance is for this, and it's not available for other uses. This next one I think you all are familiar with. And this is a reserve in fund balance for potentially underfunded pension liabilities. When we bring to you periodically updates, well, you get a monthly update, which includes a list from the state retirement system of which people are not retired, but they're on the cusp of retiring, and based upon the numbers today, would have some kind of underfunded pension liability, which we will be invoiced for from the state treasurer. And now that the litigation associated with that is done, as those invoices do come to us, unless something changes, we are legally responsible to pay those bills. So we maintain this reserve based upon our estimated future liability, and we'll adjust this reserve if we see that liability going up. We'll also adjust it if we see it going down. We do that once a year. But that's what this reserve represents, and it is in the amount of $4.3 million as of June 30th. And again, this, like everything else I've spoken about thus far, there's going to be an exception. You're going to have some availability. This is not available for other uses. Okay, again, we're still in that same assigned category, but it's a separate line item. It's called flexible benefits. And let me explain flexible benefits, just to make sure we're on the same page. We offer our employees the opportunity to have some money withheld from their paycheck and put into a health savings account. And it's a benefit to them because they don't have to pay tax dollars on it, but they can still use 100% of the money they put in and take money back out to pay their health costs. And it's a way to avoid taxes. So this amount of $1 million represents the amount that we've withheld of our employees' pay. It was never even districts, it was the employees' pay that they have access to pull back out to make payments during the year against their medical bills. And again, it's not available for other use. And again, GASB 54 says this is where we have to report that, and it has to go here. And this one, you're familiar with as well, although you're used to seeing this when we do our annual budget and not here. I think for all board members that are present, you've been through at least one budget cycle, and many of you for more. But we have historically used relative to the total operating budget, but used an amount of fund balance to put into a subsequent year's budget to balance the budget. And this amount, which is in the amount of $39.3 million, is the amount that was put into the current year budget. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, $32.4 million to balance the current year budget, but it was on the books as of June 30th and to be recognized as funding reserve for the 23-24 budget. And again, GASB 54 says we have to report that, and this is where it has to be shown. And again, that's not available for other uses. Now I'm going to get to say something that I don't have to say, can't be used for other uses, but it's the only line item on this list. Unassigned fund balance. This is the amount of fund balance that is not reserved for a specific use. It's $39.3 million, and it represents about 1.7% of our total operating budget. And I think when Trish does her presentations of the annual comprehensive annual report, she points out that that will keep the district running for a few business days, and that's about it. It, for several reasons, is really only for emergency use. Or, and our board policy, which I'm going to get to next, 8101, says it can be appropriated into a subsequent year budget, as we have done, and as we have done for the current year as well. Unlike other sources of funding, like local funding, the county appropriation, and state funding, I don't know if I can use federal funding as an example of recurring revenue at this point or not. This is not really a recurring source of funding, but this unassigned amount, it increases when prior year's revenue are greater than the expenditures, and it reduces when the revenues are less than the expenditures. And so ideally, it should not be looked at as a recurring funding source, and it should not be looked at as used for day-to-day operations, and it really should be used for, as I said, a portion of it. Board policy says how much could be used to balance the subsequent year's budget or for emergency use. But this is the one category that the board in an emergency would have the capacity to say, or we would have the capacity to ask you to approve an appropriation from this amount for whatever the emergency use is. But then you, as the board, would have the authority and need to approve it and support it or not. So I'm going to jump now to the one policy we have on the books that speaks to the fund balance, and it speaks just to the one line item on this unassigned fund balance. And I do want to point out, you see the policy 8101, it's titled undesignated operating fund balance, and it doesn't say unassigned. GASB, somewhere along the way, just changed the terminology they use for this category from undesignated to unassigned. That's all they changed. They didn't change the definition of it. They didn't change the reporting of it. They just changed that one word. When we go through the policy migration for this, we will bring this. We may have other changes, but this we would ask you to update from undesignated. Did not believe that the Board of Education needed to maintain any amounts in an unassigned fund balance for use in emergencies. And they were fairly, from my perspective, adamant about that, at least the ones who had the majority control of that board. The Board of Education was desirous of having something codified that could allow them, or would basically require them, to maintain a unassigned fund balance for those same reasons. And the county commissioners, the majority at the time, they felt that, and I use these terms, they are quotes from the time. One commissioner, Board of Education, don't worry, we're your bankers. If you have an emergency need, just come to us, we'll stroke you a check. So that's a little bit background on this policy. And really, two main tenets in this. The one being codify something for a Board of Education that would require them to target maintaining an unassigned fund balance, but also balance that with language within that same policy that would send a signal and say we as a Board of Education are not just trying to build up some huge war chest and for, a future huge need, because as some of the commissioners at the time said, well, those are taxpayer dollars going unused. And while that is a correct statement, just as a household maintains in a healthy situation, what happens if I lose my job with a little money in the bank for emergencies? This Board of Education is like no other. It's no different. So that was the basis for it. I'm going to run through the policy. And I'm going to go just through the bullets at the bottom. The board targets maintenance of an undesignated operating fund balance no greater than 6% of the subsequent year's county appropriation. That was a targeted amount for the maximum that the board would accumulate. And currently, the current year county appropriation here is what, just under 700? The amount I think currently would be about 45 million would be the 6% mark. The board will return to Wake County any undesignated operating fund balances in excess of the 6% target on an annual basis. And that 702 million, so right around $42-43 million would be the 6% amount. That second line was put in there to assure the community and the county commissioners the board was not trying to build up a war chest. I'm going to come back and speak to that. But let me stay on the 6%. The Board of Education has been in situations in two different periods of time during the Great Recession and during the pandemic where they have been in excess of those 6% thresholds. And we have asked, and the boards through those times have approved waiving the policy to allow us to retain the amounts over the 6% and not return them to the county, knowing that we were retaining them, knowing we had fiscal cliffs to face in uncertain economies. And it varies a little bit between the Great Recession and the pandemic. So that's the one fiscal piece. And then there's another piece. The board will use no more than 50% of its July 1st undesignated fund balance to balance or provide funding for a following year's budget. The board has, again, during those two periods of time, the Great Recession and the pandemic, when by design we built up that unassigned fund balance, allowed us to waive this policy based on recommendation to put more than 50% in. We're now at the point, though, where the unassigned fund balance of $39.3 million is below that 6% threshold. So we would not, when we come to you with the proposed budget, I don't believe we're going to be proposing you to waive this policy. And the last thing I'll say, well, where'd you get 50% from? Well, the theory being, if we got this much in fund balance and we want to put an amount to balance the following year's budget, and we know fund balance doesn't recur, that would give us 2 years worth of runway to work through something and know we would have opportunity to adjust, make cuts, seek additional funding, whatever. Gives us a 2-year runway. That's where the 50% comes from. And Trish, I've gone through all the slides, but would you like to add anything on any of them?
Not unless there's any.
And we're going to go to questions in a minute, yeah. Okay. So that's our presentation. That's a simple version for a very complex set of requirements. And, yeah.
Well, thank you, Mr. Nieder, for going into this. I know this was a topic that was brought up at our retreat and in conversations with our vice chair of the committee, Chair Hegarty. I'm just going to refer to you as Chair Hegarty. It's too many.
I do the same.
we thought this would be a great topic to bring as we're going through our budget, and for the public to understand that this is a legal requirement that we have a fund balance. And so I'm grateful that you laid out the requirements and what that looks like for the public to go through that, as we are being as transparent as we can with with taxpayers' dollars. So I did see Dr. Ng's hand, and followed by Ms. Edmonds, so I'll kick it off to you two for questions.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and thank you, Mr. Leader. I always appreciate, being, good parents always have extra money kind of stashed away for a rainy day, right? So it's always good to have that. Question for part of the assigned fund balance, the targeted enrollment and the vaping funds, that particular line item, are those funds kept separate, within that line item?
Well, let me get to your question, but let me give you a little background first. You may recall that usually at the beginning of a new year, in those first months, we bring to you fund balance appropriation requests, and one would have been for this targeted enrollment, where we ask the board if you will support approving taking that, let's say, $7 million reserved for target enrollment and taking it out of the fund balance reserve and putting it into our budget in a specific budget line. And when it comes out of the reserve and it goes into that specific budget line, yes, it is locked down and just used for that purpose.
Perfect. I just want to make sure that we are keeping the targeted enrollment funds for that particular purpose, as well as the vaping settlement funds specifically for that purpose. And then under the unassigned fund balance, is there a distinguishing between money that comes from the state versus money that comes from the county? And how do we actually use that money in compliance with those rules?
That's a great question, and I'm really glad you asked it. And Terry, I may ask you to come up here too, if you mind. When we look at managing our funds, and you've heard this from Terry before as well, we try to use every state dollar that we have that will not carry over. And most of the state funding we receive every year does not carry over. So we try to utilize all that, and if we can use some form of state funding for what would have otherwise been locally funded, that allows us to save those local funds. Same premise with our federal funds. And Terry, share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, what he's describing is accurate. We look primarily daily almost. We're looking at what's paid from state funds because we try to use our state resources primarily to pay people whenever possible. So any dollar allocations we receive as a district, if it's allowable within the law, we convert those to a program code where we can pay staff and keep all of our non-personnel costs on the local budget where we can. Because the state will pay things without impacting our dollar allotments, like longevity pay or annual leave payout if someone resigns, workers' comp costs for some of our state staff. So that's something that we're monitoring ongoing to make sure that we're utilizing state funds for people, and primarily people that are more at the top of the pay scales because they might be likely to retire or resign and have some of those other costs that the state will pick up. Always trying to make sure any savings would fall to our local budget, or sometimes strategically in our grants, there might be reasons to have some carryover there. So really all the funding sources pay for everything we need to do the strategic plan for the school system. We're just piecing it together with the different funding sources and trying to make sure any savings follow local when we can.
And to kind of get back and tease a little bit more out to your question, so through the budget management that Terry just described, we can accumulate local savings by utilizing these other funds. And it's those local savings that are in this undesignated or unassigned balance. The ultimate source of them might have been somewhere else, but we can't, it's strictly local savings, but our absolute good management of using other funding sources first and using position allotments where the state will pay for a 10-month employee and they'll pay whatever their salary is. So we're going to put our most expensive people on those 10 months and put our lower step people, if we have to, on the local funding, and that's how we can generate local savings. So to your question, at the end of the day, when they're in this unassigned account, they're not restricted by federal or state requirements. They're effectively local funds.
That's what I was trying to
Yeah.
get at, yeah, thank you.
Ms. Evans?
Yes, thank you. So the vaping settlement money, I remember we had discussion about, what we wanted those funds to be used for. Was all of that, for that to be here, assigned, was that self-imposed? Or if needed in this next budget cycle, is there flexibility with those funds? I remember our discussions and what our goals were, but I'm just wondering,
So when you say flexibility, do you mean do we have the flexibility to use it in a different manner?
Correct.
So the answer to that is yes, because
Okay.
that was a settlement, and nothing in that settlement said that we had to use it for a specific purpose, but the board has said that we do want to use it for this specific purpose.
Yes.
And so the board...
just for clarity, no, I just wanted to make sure.
There's flexibility.
Yeah, okay.
That'll be a student achievement topic coming up.
Okay.
Well, I
Later this
believe
year.
it may come up as well during your budget development process.
And I do want to confirm, the amount that's been received to date is just a portion of what we anticipate receiving. So the Juul settlement portion came in 2 payments that we've received that's been recognized here. We did have to provide a percentage to the proportionate share for charter schools. That
Okay.
was deemed to be appropriate for this settlement money. We still have anticipated payments coming to us for Juul for another $1.5 million and then $1.3 million from Altria. So in total, we anticipate about 5.9, just under $6 million.
Still to come.
No, in total.
Oh,
In
okay.
total. What we've received to date is 2.9 million, of which almost 300,000 went to charters. And then we received a payment in the current year of 1.3 million. And so
That
there,
went to charters, too.
and a portion of that went to charters as well. About 143,000 went to charters.
So I have 2 other questions. Okay. So with the pension liability, I was trying to look up the teasers, policy or updates, the language in that, because with the pension liability piece, isn't that going to sunset? Like, have we figured out who is going to get trapped in that? Am I confusing 2 different
To my
issues?
knowledge, there is no sunsetting of this statute, and this will be, unless something changes, an ongoing liability of, in this case, the Board of Education into the future, again, unless something changes.
And that ultimately is what the legislation has determined, that when many districts pushed back and said, we're having to pay this penalty, now it's been resolved that it is the liability of a school district.
Okay.
And so,
And I would add that when we receive an invoice, there's a process that we have on our end that we've discussed with, I thought Neil was here, we've discussed with legal, and so there's pieces that we can look at, certain thresholds, and a certification can be submitted to say, we're actually exempt of this, and then they'll zero out the invoice, but there's certain criteria for that. So we do have a step in that process that was part of that safe harbor.
And this is just not a Wake County Public Schools issue. It's all 115 districts are facing similar issues, not just Wake County. I just wanted to...
and so I would actually go beyond, it's really any state institute. You think about universities, you think about community colleges, you think about school
Every state
districts,
agency.
Every state agency. the best thing that the board has done, the best thing, but you made a great decision when you decided to hold funds specifically for this purpose, because there are a lot of districts out there that not as nearly as large as Wake County that have had to pay $800,000 and $900,000 in pension spiking fees. And you're talking about some really small districts. And so this really is a safety net that has protected the district.
And then my final is probably more of a comment, just when you were talking about how with the insurance claims, that the state covers all of the state employees, we cover the local, but when you expanded on that, and state employees that get a local supplement, well, those that get a local supplement is a whole lot of our employees. I mean, when you just talk about, our hourly staff, and then, obviously we supplement teacher pay.
Right.
So I was just making an observation, really, and wondering, how many claims, how that impacts us, because that would cover so many.
Yeah, and I want to make a very general statement that I would want to do some research in to give you anything specific. But based upon the categories of staff that generally are exposed to and do file a claim that is supported, and this is the general statement I would want to qualify and verify, I believe the majority would probably fall into the either all locally funded or all state funded or all federally funded, and not a combination.
Okay.
But I would want to verify.
No, yeah. Okay, that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you. A couple of points I wanted to raise and see what feedback you could provide. I appreciate Vice Chair Swanson and Committee Chair Swanson, there's a lot of titles, bringing fund balance to us, because I know sometimes it can get misunderstood in the public. That, this is money we're holding, but it's not necessarily available. And when you take that total number and you boil it down to it's just 1.7% of the operating budget, why do we hold that money? And I know every year when you present the budget, you'll make the budget book and you'll identify those potential risks. And each one of those potential risks, if they happen, they're likely unbudgeted, and you would have to turn to fund balance to address any of those expenses. But I'm also wondering specifically about, here in fund balance, we're talking about money that's held, that we might need to spend or might otherwise be assigned or obligated. But I'm wondering about the other side of the ledger with revenues and cash flow. Because, right now, a lot of us are watching very carefully what's going on with federal funding. And we know the memo that came out yesterday that went to the State Department of Public Instruction, that all federal cash that would be coming in for public schools is basically frozen. And if that's IDEA money, if that's for our special education programs, if that's Title I money and Title II money, I look at all the things that we pay as recurring expenses out of those funds, our magnet grant programs, I believe a lot of that cash pays for teaching positions and personnel. And so if that money is frozen, in terms of cash flow, would we have to dip into the fund balance to pay for, basically to replace that money until it was restored?
Great question, and the short answer is that would be an option. The other options would be far more harsh and impactful in a negative way, but that would be one example. Just as an update, I learned maybe an hour ago, we were able to draw federal cash today.
From our U.S. Department of Ed, we had pushed checks, that anything we had in hand, to go ahead and cut the check and order the cash.
But that's
before
it,
5
because
p.m.
as of 5 p.m., it's a hard stop. And so back to your question, Chair Haggerty. As we continue to peel back the layers, we learn the layers of the impact and the implications. This is an area where we could use, if we have to start saying, well, how do we protect our human resources? There are other options as well that we could look at. We could look at non-personnel budgets that we have and look at utilizing them to support personnel. And again, with maybe and I'm thinking out loud with the group, with a two-pronged approach of saying, we're willing to spend this non-personnel money, hoping that this pause is unpaused and these funds, going back to when they were paused, are come back and we can make adjustments. But if that doesn't come true, then more drastic decisions would need to be made.
And so I want to add to that because this is one thing we want people to know and understand about fund balance and being able to cover things just as you said. So we've always had instances where federal funding may not come in at the appropriate time that we wanted. We've already had things budgeted. We're waiting for a program to be approved before the funds are released. And so we've always had those instances. There will even be times where it has been approved, but there may be a delay in the State Department drawing down from the federal government, which may create a delay from us drawing down from the State Department. So we do have the ability to try and balance that out to cover that until those funds come in. And what I can tell you is that we're all trying to understand what this means, because if there's this kind of freeze and we don't know when a release may come from that, then that's going to have widespread implications, not only across this district, but every school district across the state, across the nation. I can't speak for anybody else that has federal funding, so we are extremely concerned about what this means, but this helps people to understand the fund balance does help cover those things. Now, this is a unique incident that we don't know where this is going to go.
And so my final just question on that is, I know obviously you're being hit with a lot in a short period of time, but at some point, especially if this drags on, if you could share with the board the cash flow impacts, what that means in terms of how far you think the unassigned fund balance could go versus when something might have to be brought back to the board for a budget adjustment or anything that requires board action.
Absolutely, yes.
What's been shared with me just through our magnet office is that OSBN has stated a 2-week hold, and that's sort of a minimum right now. That's coming from U.S. Department of Education. Department of Public Instruction is still unpacking what this means, because as you're aware, we have competitive and we also have formula grants. And so their funding is authorized by Congress, so there are discussions ongoing and we are just waiting to hear more.
And I'll add one last thing. This memorandum from the acting director of the Office of Management and Budget, Federal Office of Management and Budget, in his memo yesterday, he states that no later than February 10th, 2025, agencies shall submit to the Office of Management and Budget detailed information on any programs, projects, or activities subject to this pause. And it goes on. So one would hope they're on a fast track to making any decisions. But again, and the only other thing I would add in here in this same memo, additionally, agencies must, for each federal financial assistance program, assign responsibility and oversight to a senior political appointee.
Plenty of other questions, but I'll defer to the rest of my colleagues.
Mr. Hershey?
So I was going to ask, and Dr. Taylor covered a lot of it, the implications of some of this, and I'm going to restate some of them and talk a little, just for a second about this. As was pointed out, Congress is responsible for funding, and so there's some question as to the legality of this executive order because of I think it's the 1974 Impoundment Act, that a president cannot do this. And I certainly emailed our 2 North Carolina senators last night. It took about 10 minutes in total. I would encourage others to do so, not just at this table, but those listening, and I will be pushing that out when I'm back in front of my personal computer. We're talking about people's jobs, potentially, if this drags on. I mean, when you made the case, when you pointed out in the executive order that it said justify spending, that could be millions, I mean, certainly hundreds of thousands of pages coming in to quote-unquote review. There's no telling when this ends if this is not brought to court and a court doesn't overturn this decision or deem it unconstitutional. But I just want to encourage people that this really has a negative impact on public schools across this country. As our superintendent said, reach out to your representatives in Congress. It does not matter, I feel like I'm at the board table, it does not matter what Democrat, Republican, let them know. Because it's in our schools, it's not just, we run the gamut of political backgrounds in our schools, and it impacts everybody. And it's a real negative, and it puts us in a really bad spot. And I'm hoping other school boards across the state are also sending that message out to their constituents as well.
Thank you, Ms. Hershey. Ms. Evans?
Thank you. So the agenda for our February 4th meeting is not out yet. I mean, I know that, but, wait, is that right? Yeah, the 4th. Do y'all feel like, I mean, are you planning to come to say something about this, some kind of follow-up on the 4th, like maybe during the work session, or because it's so new? Ms. Posey, as you said, DPI is unpacking it now. But just, I feel like we need to have a really succinct, digestible, I don't know, one-pager, if you will, for lack of a better way to phrase it, for the public to understand the implications for Wake County Public Schools, and of course, across the country. But our parents, our families, our staff need just a general understanding of how serious this is, and I'm just wondering if you feel like you'd be prepared to bring that on Tuesday.
So what I would say to that is, we don't know, and this is what I mean by that. That right now, our State Department has received zero information or guidance about this. So they have exactly what we have in the memo. They're waiting to reach out. If some guidance comes down that is more granular, what does a reporting structure look like? And so when you read that memo, that could entail just tons of reports or things that are associated with fund use, blah, blah, blah. And then you cost that out over all the school districts across the state and the nation. And then do they even have the infrastructure to review what someone submits? And so until we get more guidance, we can't really talk about how we would address those. I think what I can do, what I plan to do, is to talk about the implications as we see them and what it could potentially mean. And that these structures that we have in place, that have been in place a long time, as Mr. Hershey said, that are not partisan issues. I mean, we serve children in our Exceptional Children's Program. We rely on that funding for that. And so if that gets caught up in this is what we want people to understand, that we absolutely want accountability. We don't run from it. But we don't want accountability that stops services that we know are important. So we'll make sure we speak to it, but there may not be any additional guidance by the end.
Well, and if I may, I apologize. I don't think I said it very well, but that's the kind of thing I mean. Because I don't, not every family or every community member knows what these federal grants cover. So to your point, just examples of potential That's really what I mean, Tuesday. I know that, not the detailed deep dive of how we would respond, but just so the public understands the potential impact. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, and I would just share, because we had an executive committee looking at next Tuesday's board meetings, and I shared with the group that, the primary, just at the 500,000 foot level, big bucks of federal funding we receive are IDEA funds for our special needs students, ESSA funds, which be things like Title I, Title II, and then the last big one is the magnet grant that we receive as a district. And one last thing that I shared with the group, USDA for child nutrition. This, I think, is likely going to be many days, if not into a week or two, before we have a better sense of the more granular information. And then to Mr. Hershey's point, either if it gets tangled up in the court system, or if it doesn't get tangled up in the court system, it gets tangled up in the review process, all bets are off as far as how long this drags out.
Ms. Rice?
Thank you, Chair Swanson. I just kind of want to echo something, and just as a point of guidance, when you all do what you think is best with sharing, I just want to encourage us to use language. I like to say unpack it. Please don't use language that we at this table understand or you alone understand. It is very imperative that the language that you guys use with proposing and sharing anything with parents is to talk to people who do not understand what we understand. Use very specific language of saying things very simple. Your child's school lunch could be stopped. We really have to use language that is very direct and not be so intelligent to a manner that it's beyond the average person who is not a part. Intelligence in reference to understanding educational language is what I'm saying. Not intelligence as is people not being competent, but it's very important that that type of language goes out in figuring out a way of how to break those terms down, particularly around IDEA and the child nutrition piece. I think that if we can hit those points, families will grasp the urgency of where we are with being in limbo. I think, like Dr. Taylor said, transparency is fine, but transparency in the measure in which we are doing it at the federal government level is a danger and a harm to society. And we need to express that that's exactly what's happening, so families won't all of a sudden, who's supposed to have free and reduced lunch, come to school and no one's child can eat. And I think we need to lay that and make that type of language very clear to the public, because if we don't, everybody will think that it's just certain people just trying to not care about government being cleaned up and not know your children won't eat. And it's very simple. Your children will not get your special education services. No services that folks need their psychologists, their educational psychologists to do the testing for your special needs child is over. It's halt. And we need to understand that's exactly where we are. And that language has to be made plain to people, because people think this is just some type of, I hate to say a game, but it's not a game. These are people's lives. And I need our public to understand, taking away these funds to do the necessary assessment that whatever federal government feels like they need to do, these are the consequences behind it to the average family. And I don't think that cuts a divide of socioeconomics. That's still the same families who have certain services, who have certain affluence, who receive the services within our district and know how to utilize them. Those services will be no longer accessible to you.
We'll go Ms. Mahaffey and then Ms. Coffin. Unless Mr. Nieder wanted,
I agree with Ms. Rice that the need for plain language when information like this, like communication, goes out to families, it needs to be, I think we have a way to either, edu-speak or legalese, because we want to make sure that we get it right. And that goes for all district communication to families, frankly. I do want to get back to fund balance real quick. I'm sorry. I think that the importance, it's easy to think of the unassigned fund balance as this free-for-all of, oh, it's here and we can access it. And I want to highlight, I think it was 2017 or 18, Mr. Nieder, remind me, where we had an issue where our buses were, for lack of a better term, catching on fire. I think that's the accurate description. And this was a known recall of our transportation. And the state said, well, we know this is a thing, but it's up to the districts to fix it. And we did not have enough money in unassigned fund balance in order to fix the problem. So we had to go to the county commissioners for that, and I believe in order to also increase, was it special ed transportation services? And get that. And that was, a bizarre, not bizarre, but it was an interesting process of having to ask that. But this was also in times where things were a little more economically certain and less unknown. And so I don't know how much of that will be an option moving forward. So I just want to highlight, even though it seems like it's an option, it may not be an option because the commissioners are having to do that. So a larger unassigned fund balance may seem like we're being fiscally irresponsible, but I'm with Wing. We'll stuff it in the mattress and save it for later when needed.
So, Ms. Mahaffey, I appreciate that comment, and what we always want people to understand is that an unassigned fund balance is really there for those kinds of purposes if something comes up unexpected. We do recognize that you can have all kinds of recommendations about what you should have in a fund balance for continued operations. I think at this point we'd be talking about maybe 3 or 4 days of operation. And so what I would say to people is that that's sort of smoke and mirrors, because if we ever ended up in a situation where we had to use fund balance to operate, we can only do it for 3 days. That means we're really making some much bigger decisions in order to deal with that situation. So it really is for the purposes that you talked about, when something really large comes up, and we have it there, because if it does come up, we will have to go to the commissioners. And so that was a classic example that, and I won't name that engine type because I know what it is.
I know.
But that's what people need to understand. It is there for a reason.
And I would just add to both Ms. Mahaffey and Dr. Taylor's comments. Wake County, or boards of education in the state, are unique from most other boards of education in that you don't have taxing authority. The county, for example, maintains the equivalent of an unassigned fund balance too. That is hundreds of millions of dollars. But a distinction between the county government and the Board of Education is, one, they have taxing authority, two, they have both the capacity as well as the responsibility to issue debt. And when they issue debt, to get the best interest rates, they want to have the best credit ratings. And to have the best credit ratings, I'm really simplifying this, have the best credit ratings, they have to have a higher than prescribed amount of unassigned fund balance. So in the event their revenues go down, they have reserves that can continue to pay the debt. So for boards of education in this state, there really are no prescribed, your unassigned fund balance should be this % of that.
Thank you. So I have two questions. With some of these programs that we're using for federal funding, and as a matter of like accounting and like we're talking about how we're kind of being smart and having reserves and things are like allocated for what we may need. And I do believe it's very important to have the language because there's plenty of families out there that they may even be receiving some of these services and don't know what the technical terms are. So I think like even if you said ESSER funds, they may not know that that means Title I that they're receiving, that they signed in the beginning of the year. Some families just simply don't understand. They're just following, what the school is directing them with. How long before we need to act, since certain things may be put on hold, and I know you said you were able to do your checks today, with all the planning that we have ahead, how long before we have to, we don't pay out daily, so how long before we have to be concerned if this is not settled?
That's a $25 billion question.
Like, is it a month? Is it weeks? Is it days?
I think at this point, we're going to have to play this literally day by day and hour by hour. And I really...
So this would be my response, that if this is implemented the way that it appears on paper, and there's not a clear way that the federal government will review and say that you are in compliance, then there is no reaction that we can do. And I know that sounds harsh. That's saying that we've got 10 soldiers to protect this post, and somebody is sending 100,000. You can do what you want, but there's just no way that you can react to that. And so if they say that we're not in compliance, then when you think about all of the programs that are federally impacted, particularly employees, and again, that goes back to that 3 days of operating expenses. We could literally say that we can use that fund balance of $39 million to pay whatever federal salaries that may be frozen up, and you all may know the number off the top of your head.
$41 million.
Boom, there you go. There you go.
Through the end of June.
Yeah. And so that's just the salary piece alone. And so that would be my response, that until we have some really clear guidance of how we can operate, there is not a preparation that I know we would have. Well, we could go to the commissioners. We could go to the General Assembly, but I think I know what the response would be. So, but...
I'm just saying the clear language would be helpful.
Absolutely.
Because you don't want everybody thinking that this is like nobody's going to get paid, nobody's going to get a salary. It's affecting certain things, so I think it's helpful to understand that. And when you said like 41 million in salaries by June, I think it gives everybody a little bit more understanding of what that is. And before you listed out what some of the specific programs are. So I think it's helpful for families to hear that. And then with the fund balance itself, I just wanted to know, this was back to what we were talking about before. Can you just like kind of simplify it a little bit just to make sure I understand it correctly? At the end of the budget season, what we have left in our fund balance, what do we do with those funds? Are you saying that we repurpose them so that they're kind of spent in the spot that we need for the following year?
The easiest way to understand it is you build up your savings account, and then now that gives us the flexibility to be able to fund things in the upcoming budget. And so I think what the board has always done, and the expectation that we have, is that we try not to fund permanent programs or permanent salaries out of a fund balance, because that can end. We really do look at one-time items, and so to help kind of understand how those funds are built again, the one thing that a superintendent looks for is a finance department that is savvy enough to know how to change appropriate things out. And so we have a teacher, 2 teachers, and we employ them. One making, $65,000 and one making $35,000. Now, the state doesn't care who you put on their roll; they're going to do it. So if we put that higher funded teacher on the state payroll, and that other person is paid out of federal funds or a dollar allotment that we can carry. When you switch that, that allows us to be able to change. If there's a locally paid teacher that we put on the state payroll and switch someone local, whatever that savings is, that's the additional funding that we accumulate, and it just simply allows you to build your savings. Now, what the state has also done is taken away a lot of the flexibility and things that we were able to exchange. I know many years ago, I'll call it cashing in a teacher, and there was a dollar amount that you got. Now they've reduced it down to just the beginning amount, even if we have the ability to cash it in anymore. But it's just the savings that you have when you switch the funding around, and then whatever we have that's left, we will put that into the fund balance, and then we're able to use that for the upcoming year. So you all want to add that.
And then at the end of the year, it carries over into the subsequent.
Okay, that's what I was trying to understand, sorry.
I also wanted
Sorry if I
to
asked that.
point out that fund balance is a point-in-time number. It's not like a living account that keeps changing. The true fund balance is determined one time at the end of the year when we close our books. And it's a combination of, did our revenues come in higher or lower than budget? And did our expenditures, actually not even budget, did our expenditures come in less than our revenues? And by how much? And the number is determined once the audit is complete and we close our books. And that is the fund balance number as reported to you all, and it remains that way unless you choose to appropriate money out of it. But it doesn't grow or change at all until that next time. So it really is kind of regenerated each year. It is a closing of the books calculation and figure. The only thing you know during the year is if we do identify savings, we kind of sequester it in an account so that we know that that would be a place where we would underspend our expenditures. We don't know if revenues will even meet or come in higher at that point. And we've already kind of cautioned you that this year is very tight, tighter than we've typically seen, and we've heard that also from the county. So even with all this other going on, we already are seeing things tightening.
So we're always hoping to replenish and come back to square one, basically, so we have that under the mattress kind of thing.
I mean, a goal, I don't think our goal is ever to do something to fund balance. I mean, what we want to do is budget appropriately, so what we're asking for and utilizing the funds needed to do what we've said we want to spend, so that we're wisely using funds, knowing that it is beneficial to the school system to meet our board policy, so that there is some savings there as you need to maneuver during the year, and that's helpful.
And I would say, from a fiduciarily responsible fiscal management perspective, a target for an unassigned fund balance for an organization such as a Board of Education in the state that doesn't have taxing authority, doesn't really have the authority to enter into or issue debt, would be in normal times to maintain a fund balance that provides, in this case, the Board of Education, emergency reserves to manage through unforeseen situations, but a reasonable amount that is fiduciarily responsible to the taxpayers of the community and not a war chest. And then in uncertain times, such as during the Great Recession or the pandemic, when there are known fiscal challenges, consider building that unassigned fund balance up through expenditure restrictions, or saying there's no out-of-state travel, or we're freezing vacant positions. So intentionally build it up, knowing there will be shortfalls in subsequent year or years. But then when things get back to normal, if that amount is still perhaps at an extraordinary level, get it back down.
Dr. King, and then Ms. Mahaffey, did you have a question?
No, I went back and forth, but I'm good.
Dr.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying more. And I think, that just goes to show that we're going to have a very big decision to make in our budget talks this year. But at the same time, I just want to make sure that we don't fall into the situation where, like you mentioned about possibly dipping into funds that we don't usually dip into to pay for our staff, and then forgetting about the fact that we dipped into that pool, and then we kind of leave those priorities behind. And I don't want that to happen. We have to, I'm hoping for a better day. And that better day means that we will go back and try to look at those priorities and fulfill those commitments we have made. And so, I just want to make sure that we all have that commitment to do that.
There is one thing I would like to add. The educational programs are 41 million. If we were responsible for child nutrition, that's another 20 million in projected salaries through the end of the year.
Could you state that again, please?
So for educational program grants, that's the 41 million in salaries only, not non-personnel. And then for child nutrition programs, it's roughly 20 million. So they have projected salaries that don't always project, so I kind of rounded up their number from their 18.9 million.
Is this through the end of the calendar year, the fiscal year, the school year?
Fiscal year.
Fiscal year, thank you.
Yes.
So, Ms. Posey, would that 41 million include contracted services?
It is
for
just
speech
salary
pathologists or
people in
nurses?
positions.
Just people that are employed by the district? Okay, thank you.
Today. That doesn't mean vacancies. Vacancies don't show up in those projections.
Ms. Rice?
Point of clarity, Ms. Posey. And so that I think I heard you say that this is what we would have to pay if,
This is just the federal
Right.
grant salaries. That's just information of salaries today, what's projected through the end of the fiscal year.
right,
We are still waiting on information from the state and from the federal.
That's for people that are currently hired.
Yes.
and
In a
again,
federal-related position.
this is the funding that we need, or that we're waiting for them to send, or this is what it's costing us just for salaries alone,
These are
correct?
This would be
Projected.
Projected
Project-
salaries
okay.
through the end
I
of the
just-
year.
from now through the end of the
Right, that's, okay, I wanted to make sure projected, okay, thank you.
And we want to also emphasize that the idea is that you would use those funds to maintain all the programmatic aspects, but that at some point you would expect that funding to be released by the federal government, and then you could come back and obviously replace that local funding. But obviously the problem is if you use it for coverage, it doesn't give you the flexibility to address anything else that may have come up that you would have used the fund balance for.
I think you took a piece I was going to reference. There is, once we use it, we do have to replenish it.
Yeah.
And how that looks, what and how that looks like is very up in the air at this point. Mr. Nieder, Ms. Posey, Ms. Kimsey, any last words to close us out?
I would just say thank you for your time, letting us make this presentation. Hope we gave you a little bit better understanding of what fund balance is, what it isn't, as well as the community, whoever's listening, and also gave us the opportunity to talk about what's currently in our midst. So thank you.
And we will adjourn this January meeting, and it'll be the same place, same time next month. So thank you all.